The world of Alexander Vance was one of polished surfaces and silent transactions. From the 50th floor of Vance International, the city below was a sprawling circuit board, and he, the primary architect of its energy. His office was a monument to minimalism and power, all cool marble and steel, a space where the very air seemed hushed in deference. At 48, Alexander had built an empire from a combination of ruthless intellect, relentless drive, and a carefully cultivated detachment. He dealt in mergers and acquisitions, in the abstract transfer of billions, a world far removed from the messy unpredictability of human emotion. His personal life was another perfectly managed subsidiary. His wife, Isabelle, was a vision of curate elegance, a former ballet dancer whose grace had seamlessly transitioned from the stage to the charity gala. Their life together was a series of beautiful, frozen moments, photographs from ski trips in Gstaad, gallery openings in New York, quiet dinners in their immaculate penthouse. It was a life many envied, but for Alexander, it had become a familiar rhythm, a symphony played on a loop. The one vibrant, unpredictable note in this composition was his daughter, Elara. Elara, at 4 years old, was the sole inheritor of her father's unguarded smiles. She had her mother's delicate features, but her eyes held a warmth that was entirely her own. That afternoon, Alexander had left the office early, a rare deviation from his schedule. He found Elara in the private park adjacent to their building, a manicured green space reserved for the residents of the elite complex. She was supposed to be with her nanny, Anya, but Alexander saw Anya sitting on a bench, engrossed in her phone, while Elara had wandered towards the high, wrought iron fence that separated their privileged turf from the public sidewalk. It was there that Alexander saw her. A woman, hunched and dressed in worn, faded clothing, was standing on the other side of the fence. Her hands were gripping the bars, and she was speaking intently to Elara, who was looking up at her with an expression of rapt attention. A cold spike of alarm shot through Alexander. His paternal instincts, usually dormant beneath layers of corporate armor, flared to life. This was a breach of security, a potential threat to his most precious asset. He strode across the lawn, his expensive shoes sinking silently into the perfect grass, his mind already composing a terse dismissal for the nanny and a firm warning for the stranger. He was 10 feet away when he heard the woman's voice, carried on a faint breeze. It was tired, raspy, but clear. She was looking down at Elara, her face a mask of strange, sorrowful tenderness. "And I used to be your wife's nurse," the woman said. Alexander froze. The reprimand died on his lips. The world, for a moment, tilted on its axis. The sounds of the city faded into a dull roar. He stared at the woman, truly seeing her for the first time, the frayed edges of her coat, the weary slope of her shoulders, the deep lines etched around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. And in that face, he saw a ghost. A faded, weathered ghost from a chapter of his life he and Isabelle had meticulously closed, sealed, and stored away. This was Clara. And her sudden reappearance was not a random plea for charity, it was an echo from a past he had believed was buried forever. Memories, long suppressed, flooded Alexander's mind with the force of a shattered dam. 5 years ago. Isabelle, radiant and full of life, her pregnancy the subject of countless celebrations. Then, the sudden, terrifying silence of a stilled heartbeat during a routine checkup. The frantic rush to the hospital, the grim-faced doctors, the harrowing emergency C-section to save Isabelle's life. The aftermath was a blur of sterile white corridors and the crushing, profound grief of losing the son they had already named Leo. Isabelle had been submerged in a deep, post-operative depression, compounded by the hormonal crash and the trauma of her loss. Alexander, grappling with his own sorrow, had buried himself in work, building higher walls around his heart. The nursing staff had been a rotation of kind, efficient faces, but one had been different. Clara. She was older than the others, her hands capable and gentle, her presence a calm, steady anchor in the storm. She was the one who had sat with Isabelle through the long, tear-filled nights when Alexander couldn't, when the sight of his wife's pain was a mirror to his own that he couldn't bear to face. He remembered Clara speaking to Isabelle in low, soothing tones, not with the clinical detachment of a medical professional, but with the raw empathy of someone who had known profound loss herself. She had been their rock. But then, something had shifted. Isabelle, in her fragile state, had become convinced that Clara was overstepping, that her kindness was a form of pity she found unbearable. In a fit of pique and pain, she had demanded Clara be removed from their case. Alexander, eager to grant his wife any comfort, any semblance of control, had complied without question. He had arranged for Clara's transfer, and in doing so, he had signed the paperwork that included a substantial, discreet severance package. Hush money, he now realized, though he had never allowed himself to call it that. He had paid to make an uncomfortable memory disappear. Now, that memory was standing before him, holding the gaze of his daughter. Elara, the miracle child born 2 years later, a child they had been told was nearly impossible after the complications of the first birth. Elara, who knew nothing of the brother who came before her, or the darkness that had surrounded her parents. Clara's eyes met Alexander's over the top of the fence. There was no anger in them, only a deep, resonant exhaustion, and a flicker of recognition. She did not flinch under his stunned gaze. She gave Elara one last, sad smile, then turned and began to walk away, her figure quickly being swallowed by the foot traffic on the sidewalk. Alexander stood rooted to the spot, the carefully constructed reality of his life cracking around him. The nanny, finally noticing his presence, hurried over, full of flustered apologies that Alexander waved away with a numb hand. He picked up Elara, holding her tightly, her small, warm body a stark contrast to the cold dread seeping into his bones. The walk back to the penthouse was a silent, haunted journey. The penthouse had never felt so much like a gilded cage. That evening, Alexander moved through the rooms like a ghost himself. Isabelle was at her weekly yoga class, and the silence of the home was oppressive. He kept replaying the scene at the fence, the look on Clara's face, the haunting echo of her words. "I used to be your wife's nurse." It wasn't an accusation, yet it felt like one. It was a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. He tried to dismiss it. She was down on her luck, he told himself. She had seen his name, recognized him or his wife, and saw an opportunity. It was a calculated play for sympathy, for money. It had to be. But the memory of her eyes, devoid of guile, filled only with a weary sorrow, refused to align with this convenient narrative. A desperate person's eyes held a certain hunger, Clara's held a profound resignation. When Isabelle returned, glowing from her workout and full of chatter about a new art acquisition for the foundation, Alexander found he could not meet her gaze. He watched her, this beautiful stranger he shared his life with, and for the first time, he saw the performance. The effortless grace that was, in fact, a meticulously rehearsed routine. The shared history they presented to the world felt, suddenly, like a curated exhibit. Over a dinner of seared scallops prepared by their private chef, he casually, too casually, mentioned it. "A strange thing happened today. At the park. A woman was talking to Elara at the fence. She said, she claimed she was your nurse. From the hospital. After Leo." The change in Isabelle was instantaneous and terrifying. The color drained from her face, leaving her porcelain skin a ghastly white. Her fork clattered against her plate, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet dining room. Her eyes, wide and startled, darted to his and then away, a frantic, caged animal. Who that's impossible. I don't remember any of them. It was a terrible time. Her voice was too high, too sharp. It was Clara, Alexander said, his tone deliberately neutral, watching her closely. The name hung in the air between them. Isabelle's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. Clara, that pushy woman, what did she want? Was she begging Alexander? You can't let these people near Elara, you must have security review the park protocols immediately. Her reaction was a torrent of defensive anger, a complete refusal to engage with the past, a swift redirection towards threat and privilege. It was the reaction of the Isabelle he knew, the one who controlled her world by shutting out anything unpleasant. But now, for the first time, Alexander saw the fear beneath the fury. He saw the crack in the marble facade, and the darkness that lay behind it. Sleep was impossible that night. Alexander lay beside Isabelle's rigid, pretending to sleep form, his mind racing. Isabelle's reaction had been wrong. It wasn't the response of someone confronted with a mildly unpleasant memory, it was the panic of someone whose deepest secret was threatening to surface. He replayed the events of 5 years ago with new, suspicious eyes. Isabelle's sudden, intense animosity toward Clara, the one nurse who had been their steadfast comfort. His own willingness to make the problem go away with a check and a signed document. He had been so focused on fixing things, on managing the crisis, that he had never stopped to ask why. The next morning, under the pretense of an early international conference call, Alexander retreated to his home study. The door clicked shut, sealing him in a world of wood and leather, a world he commanded. He opened his laptop, but instead of stock tickers and merger documents, he opened a search engine. His fingers hovered over the keys. He was Alexander Vance. He found things out for a living. He uncovered weaknesses in companies, hidden assets, lies. He had never thought to turn that skill set on his own life. He started with the hospital records, using contacts that bypassed standard protocols. He pulled up Isabelle's file from that time. The clinical notes were as he remembered: emergency C-section, stillbirth, post-operative care, severe postpartum depression. But then he saw a footnote, a reference to an internal review. It was vague, citing a medication discrepancy. The nurse listed on the incident report was Clara Higgins. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He began a deeper dive into Clara. It took his resources most of the day to find her. She had no social media presence, no digital footprint. She lived in a part of the city Alexander's limousine never drove through. The background check his security firm finally provided was a bleak read: a single mother, a son with chronic health issues, a series of low-paying jobs after her dismissal from the prestigious hospital, a recent eviction notice. She had fallen off the edge of the world he inhabited. The pieces were not adding up to the simple story of a bitter ex-employee. They painted a picture of a woman who had been profoundly wronged. The medication discrepancy gnawed at him. He called an old friend, a doctor who now sat on the board of another hospital. He described the situation in abstract terms, a hypothetical case. His friend listened, then said, "A discrepancy like that, especially with a high-profile patient, it's a career ender. It usually implies either theft or a deliberate misadministration. But if she was so good, why would she make such a mistake?" Why indeed, Alexander thought, a terrible suspicion beginning to take root. What if it wasn't a mistake at all? What if Clara had been set up? The thought was so monstrous he almost dismissed it. But the image of Isabelle's panicked face at dinner refused to fade. He had built his fortune on understanding leverage and motive. He now had to apply that same cold logic to his wife. What was her motive to remove a witness to what he found Clara 2 days later, in a cramped, dimly lit cafe near the bus depot? She was not surprised to see him. She looked at him from her booth, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of her, as if she had been waiting for this moment for 5 years. He slid into the seat opposite her. The air smelled of stale grease and disinfectant. "I looked into your record," he began, his voice low. "The medication discrepancy." Clara's eyes held his. There was no plea in them, only a weary truth. "There was no discrepancy, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Your wife asked me to bring her a stronger painkiller. One that was not on her chart. She was in a great deal of pain," she said. "Emotional pain." "When I refused, explaining it was against protocol and dangerous without a doctor's order, she became agitated. Later, that same medication was found in my locker." Alexander listened, the truth settling over him like a shroud. It was as he had feared, yet hearing it aloud was a physical blow. "She told the head nurse I was pressuring her to take it, that I was incompetent," Clara continued, her gaze drifting to the grimy window. "She said horrible things about me to you, and you believed her. You had me removed. That mark on my record, no other hospital would touch me. Nursing was my life. It was how I supported my boy." Her voice broke for the first time. "He has cystic fibrosis, Mr. Vance. The insurance from that job, it was everything." Alexander felt a nausea rise in him. He had not just fired a nurse, he had shattered a life. He had been so desperate to placate Isabelle, to smooth over the ragged edges of their grief, that he had destroyed an innocent woman without a second thought. He had paid her off, and in doing so, he had convinced himself he had handled the situation justly, cleanly. He had been a fool. "I saw your picture in the society pages a few months ago," Clara said, bringing her eyes back to his. "With your little girl. She's beautiful. She looks healthy. I was happy for you. Truly. But then I lost my last job. My son, he needs a new treatment. I was desperate. I didn't go there to threaten you. I saw her in the park, and she looked so much like the mother I remembered from the hospital, the one who was so broken. I just wanted to see her. To know that some good came out of all that pain. I'm sorry I frightened you." Her apology was the final, crushing weight. Alexander Vance, the titan of industry, sat humbled in a greasy spoon, faced with a decency and resilience that made his wealth and power seem trivial. He had come here seeking answers, and he had found a verdict.